On a dusty afternoon in the Wyoming Territory, a struggling rancher rides past the railroad tracks when he spots something that stops him cold. A little girl, no more than 6 years old, sitting alone in the dirt, her face streaked with tears. Caleb Monroe knows getting involved could mean trouble. In 1885, a man like him, barely scraping by, with a reputation for being an outsider, doesn't always get the benefit of the doubt. But as the child looks up at him, terrified and lost, he makes a choice. He doesn't know that this one act of kindness will set off a chain of events that could change everything. Because the next day, a massive steam engine pulls up outside his failing ranch, and the man who steps off isn't just anyone. He's one of the most powerful railroad tycoons in the West, and he's come with an offer that Caleb never saw coming. Caleb Monroe sat at the edge of his rickety wooden chair, elbows resting on his knees, staring at the worn floorboards of his small ranch house. The morning light filtered through the gaps in the shutters, casting thin lines across the room. The air smelled of old leather, dust, and the faint trace of wood smoke from the stove that barely kept the place warm during the cold nights. 3 years ago, this ranch had been his pride. He'd worked cattle drives, saved every penny, and bought this land with dreams of building something real, something he could pass down to his son. But drought had come 2 summers in a row, his herd had dwindled to almost nothing, and the bank had started sending letters he couldn't answer because he didn't have the money. Now he took whatever work he could find, fixing fences for neighbors, hauling timber into town, mucking out stables at the livery for a few coins. It was never enough. The mortgage was 3 months overdue, and the banker, a thin, cold-eyed man named Thornton, had made it clear that Caleb was running out of time. He pushed himself up from the chair and walked to the small kitchen area. The cupboard was nearly bare. A sack of flour, half a tin of beans, some strips of dried beef that were more jerky than meat. He grabbed the tin and dumped the beans into a pot, adding water from the bucket by the door. "Sam," he called, his voice rough but gentle. "Breakfast." A moment later, his 8-year-old son shuffled in, barefoot, his shirt too big and his pants held up by a fraying rope belt. Samuel Monroe was thin, too thin, but his eyes still had that spark of hope that Caleb both loved and feared. Hope was dangerous when you had nothing to back it up. Sam climbed onto the wobbly bench and watched as Caleb ladled beans onto a chipped plate. "Thanks, Pa," Sam said, picking up his fork. Caleb sat across from him, forcing himself to eat even though his stomach was tight with worry. He watched his boy take slow, careful bites, savoring every mouthful like it was a feast. "Pa?" Sam said after a while, looking up. "Yeah, son? You think we'll ever get more cattle? Like we used to have?" Caleb's throat tightened. He wanted to promise him that they would, that one day this ranch would be full of life again, horses running in the pasture, cattle grazing on the hills, a future that didn't involve scraping by day after day. But promises didn't pay debts, and dreams didn't keep the lights on. "We'll see," Caleb said, his voice quiet. "We'll see." Sam nodded, like he believed it. Caleb wished he could. After breakfast, Caleb saddled up his horse, a tired old mare named Dusty, and prepared to ride into town. He needed to pick up supplies from Miller's General Store. Not much. Just enough to last them until he could find another job, another way to keep them afloat. Sam stood by the fence, waving as Caleb rode off. "Be back soon, Sam. Stay close to the house." "I will, Pa." Caleb urged Dusty forward, the dry wind kicking up dust around them as they headed down the dirt road toward Dustridge. He didn't know it yet, but this ride would change everything. The ride into Dustridge took nearly an hour, the sun climbing higher in the cloudless sky as Dusty plodded along the worn trail. Caleb kept his hat pulled low, shielding his eyes from the glare. The landscape stretched out around him, endless plains of dry grass, scattered mesquite, and the distant silhouette of mountains that looked more like shadows than solid ground. This land had once felt like freedom, Now it felt like a prison with no walls. He thought about the letter folded in his pocket, the one from Thornton at the bank. Final notice, it said across the top in bold, unforgiving letters. Caleb had read it so many times he'd memorized every word. He had 2 weeks. 2 weeks to come up with 6 months' worth of payments, or the bank would seize the ranch. Everything he'd built, everything he'd promised Sam, gone. The worst part wasn't losing the land. It was the look he knew would be in Sam's eyes when he had to tell him they were leaving. That quiet, brave acceptance his boy always showed, even when the world kept taking things from him. Sam deserved better than this. Better than a father who couldn't provide, who couldn't protect him from the hard edges of life. Caleb's jaw tightened. He'd been working himself to the bone, but it didn't matter. No matter how many fences he mended or how many loads he hauled, the money slipped through his fingers faster than water through a sieve. And Dusty, his faithful mare, was getting older. Her breathing had been labored lately, and he knew she wouldn't last many more hard rides. If she gave out, so did his last real chance of finding work beyond walking distance. When he finally reached Dustridge, the town was alive with midday activity. Wagons rolled down the main street, kicking up clouds of dust. Men gathered outside the saloon, their voices carrying across the dirt road. Women in long dresses moved between the general store and the seamstress shop, baskets on their arms. Caleb tied Dusty to the hitching post outside Miller's general store and stepped inside. The bell above the door jingled, and the cool shade of the interior was a relief from the relentless sun. Edgar Miller stood behind the counter, a portly man with a thick mustache and suspicious eyes. He looked up when Caleb entered, and his expression shifted, friendly enough on the surface, but guarded underneath. "Monroe," Miller said with a nod. "Miller." Caleb approached the counter, pulling a short list from his pocket. "Need a few things." Miller took the list, scanning it quickly. Flour, salt, coffee, a small sack of oats for Dusty, the basics, nothing more. "That'll be $4.60, Miller said, already moving to gather the items. Caleb reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a worn leather pouch. He counted out the coins carefully, setting them on the counter one by one. $4, $4.50, $4.60. That left him with less than $2 to his name. Miller scooped up the coins and slid the goods across the counter. "You holding up out there, Monroe?" It was the kind of question that sounded like concern, but felt more like curiosity. Caleb knew how it worked in small towns. People talked. Everyone knew everyone else's business, and his business wasn't good. "Managing," Caleb said, his tone flat. Miller nodded slowly, like he didn't quite believe it. "Well, if you need work, I heard the Hawthorns are hiring hands for their new rail expansion. Might be worth checking out." Caleb had heard the name before. Theodore Hawthorne, the railroad tycoon who owned half the territory and was buying up the other half. Men like Hawthorne didn't hire men like Caleb unless they were desperate for cheap labor, and even then they didn't keep them long. "I'll think about it," Caleb said, gathering his supplies. He stepped back outside into the heat, loading the goods into Dusty's saddlebags. As he prepared to mount up, his gaze drifted toward the railroad tracks at the edge of town. A distant whistle echoed across the plains, the afternoon train arriving right on schedule. Caleb swung into the saddle and turned Dusty toward home. He had 2 weeks to figure something out. 2 weeks before everything fell apart. The ride back from Dustridge was slower than usual. Dusty seemed to sense Caleb's heavy mood, her pace steady but unhurried. The sun had started its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the prairie. Caleb's mind churned with numbers that didn't add up, deadlines he couldn't meet, and a future that looked darker with each passing day. He took the long route home, following the path that ran parallel to the railroad tracks. It was a habit more than anything. Sometimes watching the trains pass gave him a strange sense of comfort. a reminder that the world kept moving even when his own life felt stuck in place. As he rounded a bend where the tracks cut through a shallow valley, something caught his eye. A small figure sitting beside the rails, barely visible against the rust-colored earth. At first he thought it might be a coyote or a piece of discarded cargo, but as he drew closer his chest tightened. It was a child. A little girl, no older than 6 or 7, sat alone on the ground near the tracks. Her dress was pale blue, far too fine for these parts. Lace trim, clean fabric that stood out like a rose in a dust storm. Her blonde hair was pulled back in ribbons, and her face was buried in her hands, small shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Caleb reined Dusty to a stop, his eyes scanning the area. No wagon, no horse, no adults anywhere in sight. Just the girl, alone in the middle of nowhere, with the sun dropping lower and the temperature already starting to fall. He sat there for a long moment, gripping the reins. Every instinct told him to keep riding. Getting involved with a lost child, especially one who clearly came from money, was asking for trouble. People like him, men who barely scraped by and looked rough around the edges, didn't get the benefit of the doubt. If someone came looking for this girl and found her with him, they wouldn't ask questions first. They'd assume the worst. He'd seen it happen before. A drifter accused of theft just for being in the wrong place. A ranch hand run out of town because a merchant's daughter said he'd looked at her wrong. In this territory, justice moved faster than truth, and men like Caleb were always guilty until proven otherwise, if they were lucky enough to get a chance to prove anything at all. But then he thought of Sam. If it were his boy out here, alone and scared, what would he want someone to do? Caleb cursed under his breath and dismounted. He approached slowly, his boots crunching softly against the gravel. The girl didn't look up at first, lost in her tears. When he was about 10 feet away, he stopped and crouched down, keeping his distance. "Hey there, little miss," he said gently, his voice low and steady. "You all right?" The girl's head snapped up, her eyes wide and red-rimmed. For a moment she just stared at him, taking in his worn hat, his dusty clothes, the rough stubble on his jaw. He saw it immediately. Fear. Not just the fear of being lost, but fear of him. His stomach twisted, but he kept his expression calm, unthreatening. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said quietly. "Just want to help. You lost?" She nodded slowly, her small hands gripping the fabric of her dress. Her lip trembled, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. I can't find my mama," she whispered, her voice so small it almost broke his heart. "The train, it stopped and I got off, and she didn't see me, and now I don't know where she is." Caleb exhaled slowly. So she'd wandered off when the train made a water stop. It happened sometimes. Passengers stretched their legs, children ran off to explore, and in the chaos of departure, someone got left behind. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lily," she said, sniffling. "Lily Hawthorne." Hawthorne. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. Of course, of all the lost children in the territory, he'd stumbled across the daughter of the most powerful man in Wyoming. He glanced at the empty tracks, then back at the girl. The next train wouldn't come through until tomorrow morning. If he left her here, she'd be alone all night, cold, scared, vulnerable to wild animals or worse. He couldn't do it. He wouldn't. "All right, Lily," Caleb said, standing slowly. "We're going to get you home, I promise." Lily looked up at him with wide, uncertain eyes. She was still trembling, her small hands clutched together in her lap, like she was trying to hold herself together. Caleb could see the war happening behind those eyes, the fear of a stranger versus the terror of being alone. He took a slow breath and gestured toward Dusty, who stood patiently a few yards away. "That's my horse, Dusty," he said, keeping his voice calm. "She's old and gentle. Won't hurt a fly. I'm going to take you into town, find out where your folks are, and get you back to them. That sound all right?" Lily hesitated, her gaze shifting between Caleb and the horse. Finally she nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Okay," she whispered. Caleb approached her slowly, crouching down again. "You think you can stand up?" She nodded and pushed herself to her feet, wobbling slightly. Her legs were shaky, probably from sitting in the sun too long without water. Caleb frowned. He pulled his canteen from his belt and held it out to her. "Here, take a drink, small sips." Lily took the canteen with both hands and drank carefully, her eyes never leaving his face. When she handed it back, there was a little less fear in her expression. Not trust, not yet, but maybe the beginning of it. Caleb straightened and walked over to Dusty, running a hand along the mare's neck. "All right, girl. We got a passenger." He turned back to Lily and extended a hand. "Come on, I'll lift you up." She walked over hesitantly, and when she was close enough, Caleb gently lifted her onto the saddle. She was light as a feather, and for a moment he was struck by how fragile she seemed. This little girl in her fine dress, so far from wherever she was supposed to be. He swung up behind her, keeping a respectful distance, and wrapped one arm loosely around her to keep her steady. "You just hold on to the saddle horn there. I won't let you fall." Lily gripped the horn tightly, and Caleb urged Dusty forward at a slow, easy pace. The sun was sinking lower now, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. They had maybe 2 hours of daylight left. As they rode, Caleb tried to piece together what to do. Dustridge was the closest town, but if the Hawthorns were as powerful as everyone said, they wouldn't be staying in some dusty boarding house. They'd have a private rail car, probably already on its way to the next stop. Or maybe they'd realized Lily was missing and sent someone back to look for her. Either way, someone was probably frantic by now. "Lily," he said after a while, his voice gentle, "do you know where your mama and papa were headed?" "What stop you were going to?" "Cheyenne," she said quietly. "We were going to Cheyenne. Papa has business there." Cheyenne. That was a full day's ride by train, much farther by horse. If the train had already reached the next station and they'd realized she was missing, they might have wired back to Dustridge. Or they might be tearing up the countryside looking for her. Caleb's jaw tightened. This was getting more complicated by the minute. They rode in silence for a while. The only sounds, the steady clop of Dusty's hooves and the whisper of wind through the grass. Then softly, Lily spoke again. "Are you a bad man?" The question hit him harder than he expected. He glanced down at her, saw the way she was looking at him, trying to figure him out, trying to decide if she was safe. "No," he said quietly. "I'm not. I got a boy about your age. His name's Sam. If he were lost out here, I'd hope someone would help him get home safe." Lily was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "Okay." After another stretch of silence, she spoke again, her voice small but sincere. "Thank you for not leaving me." Caleb felt something tighten in his chest. He didn't respond right away, just kept his eyes on the horizon as they rode toward Dustridge. When they finally reached the edge of town, the streets were quieter, the evening settling in. Caleb guided Dusty toward the sheriff's office, figuring that was the best place to start. But before he could dismount, the door swung open, and Sheriff Tom Briggs stepped out, his hand resting on his holstered revolver. His eyes locked onto Caleb, then shifted to the girl. "Monroe," the sheriff said slowly, his tone unreadable. "What have you got there?" Caleb kept his hands visible, one still steadying Lily on the saddle, the other resting on his thigh, nowhere near his belt, nowhere that could be mistaken for reaching for a weapon he didn't even carry. "Sheriff," Caleb said evenly, "found her out by the tracks. She got separated from her family when the afternoon train made a water stop." Briggs didn't move, his eyes narrowing as he studied the scene. He was a lean man with a weathered face and a reputation for being fair, most of the time. But Caleb also knew that fairness had limits, especially when it came to men who lived on the edge of respectability. "That true, little miss?" Briggs asked, his tone softening as he addressed Lily. Lily nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. I got lost, and he found me. He gave me water and brought me here." The sheriff's hand finally moved away from his revolver, though his expression remained cautious. "You're lucky Monroe found you before nightfall. Lot of dangerous things out there after dark." He stepped closer, offering a hand to help Lily down. She hesitated, glancing back at Caleb as if asking permission. He gave her a small nod, and she let the sheriff lift her to the ground. "Your name Hawthorne?" Briggs asked her. "Yes, sir, Lily Hawthorne." The sheriff's eyebrows rose slightly, and he glanced at Caleb with an expression that was hard to read, surprise, maybe, or concern. "Theodore Hawthorne's daughter?" "Yes, sir." Briggs let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned." He looked back at Caleb. "You know who her father is?" "Figured it out," Caleb said quietly. The sheriff nodded slowly, then gestured toward his office. "Come on inside, Miss Lily. We'll wire ahead to the next station. Let your folks know you're safe." As Briggs led Lily toward the office, she turned back one more time, her small voice cutting through the evening air. "Thank you, Mr. Monroe." Caleb touched the brim of his hat. "You take care, Lily." He watched them disappear inside, then let out a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His hands were steadier now, but his mind was still racing. He'd done the right thing, he knew that, but he also knew how these situations worked. Men like Theodore Hawthorne didn't just say thank you and move on. They asked questions. They wanted to know who had their daughter, where she'd been, what had happened, and Caleb had no way of knowing how those questions would land. He turned Dusty toward the edge of town, ready to head home, when Briggs stepped back outside. "Monroe, hold up." Caleb reined in, turning back. "Yeah? Hawthorne's probably going to want to meet you. Thank you proper." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Don't need thanks. Just wanted to get her home safe." "I know that," Briggs said. "But men like Hawthorne don't let debts go unpaid. You saved his daughter. He's going to want to know who you are." "Then you can tell him," Caleb said. "I got to get back to my boy." Before the sheriff could respond, Caleb urged Dusty forward and rode off into the fading light. The next morning, Caleb woke to the sound of something he'd never heard on his property before, a deep, rumbling whistle that shook the walls of his small house. He shot upright, his heart pounding. Sam was already at the window, eyes wide. "Pa! There's a train. A train stopped right outside." Caleb scrambled out of bed and moved to the window, pulling back the worn curtain. Sure enough, sitting on the spur line that ran a quarter-mile from his property, a line he'd assumed was abandoned, was a massive black steam engine. Smoke poured from its stack, and the morning sun glinted off polished brass fittings. It wasn't just any train. It was a private car, sleek and expensive, with Hawthorne and Western Railroad Company emblazoned on the side in gold lettering. Caleb's stomach dropped. A man stepped off the rear platform, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a fine black suit and a wide-brimmed hat. Even from a distance, Caleb could see the confidence in his stride, the way he moved like a man who owned everything he looked at. Theodore Hawthorne. And he was walking straight toward Caleb's house. "Stay inside, Sam," Caleb said quietly, reaching for his hat. "Who is he, Pa?" "Someone I didn't expect to see," Caleb muttered, stepping out onto the porch. Hawthorne stopped at the edge of the yard, his sharp eyes taking in the weathered house, the sagging fence, the empty corral. Then his gaze settled on Caleb, and for a long moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Hawthorne tipped his hat. "Mr. Monroe, I believe we need to talk." Caleb stepped off the porch, his boots hitting the dry earth with a dull thud. He kept his posture neutral, his expression guarded. Theodore Hawthorne stood at the edge of his property like he belonged there, like he belonged everywhere. And that confidence alone was enough to put Caleb on edge. "Mr. Hawthorne," Caleb said, his voice steady, "didn't expect a personal visit." Hawthorne's mouth curved into a slight smile, though his eyes remained sharp, assessing. I don't make a habit of leaving debts unpaid, Mr. Monroe. My daughter told me what you did for her yesterday. How you found her by the tracks, gave her water, brought her to safety. Caleb shrugged. Any decent man would have done the same. Perhaps, Hawthorne said, taking a step closer. But not every man would have, especially knowing the risk. He paused, letting the words settle. You knew who she was. You knew what people might think, what they might assume if they found you with her, and you helped her anyway. Caleb's jaw tightened. He didn't like being studied like this, like he was some kind of puzzle Hawthorne was trying to solve. I wasn't going to leave a little girl out there alone, Caleb said flatly. That's all there is to it. Hawthorne nodded slowly, as if he'd expected that answer. My wife wanted to offer you money, a reward for bringing Lily home. He reached into his coat pocket, and for a moment, Caleb thought he was about to pull out a wad of bills. But Hawthorne's hand came out empty. He let it fall back to his side. I told her you wouldn't take it. Caleb met his gaze. You told her right. That's what I thought. Hawthorne glanced around the property again. The broken fence posts, the empty fields, the house that looked like it was held together by sheer stubbornness. So, instead, I came here with a different kind of offer. Caleb frowned. What kind of offer? A job, Hawthorne said simply. I'm expanding my rail line through this territory. Need men who know the land, who can work hard, and who don't fold under pressure. From what I saw yesterday, you're that kind of man. Caleb stared at him, caught off guard. He'd been expecting a handshake, maybe some polite words, and then Hawthorne would leave, and that would be the end of it. But this was something else entirely. You don't even know me, Caleb said. I know enough, Hawthorne replied. I know you could have walked away yesterday and didn't. I know you've been working yourself to the bone trying to keep this place afloat. He gestured toward the ranch. And I know you're about to lose it. Caleb's chest tightened. How do you... I make it my business to know things, Mr. Monroe, Hawthorne said calmly. Thornton at the bank talks. A lot. You've got 2 weeks before foreclosure, and unless you've got 6 months' payment sitting in your pocket, you're not going to make it. The bluntness of it hit Caleb like a fist to the gut. He wanted to argue, to tell Hawthorne to mind his own damn business, but the truth was sitting right there between them, undeniable. Hawthorne took another step forward, his voice lowering. I'm not offering you charity, Monroe. I'm offering you a chance to earn your way out of this. Work for me. Prove you're as reliable as I think you are, and I'll make sure you've got steady pay, enough to keep this place and give your boy a future. Caleb looked past him at the train, its black steel gleaming in the morning sun. Then he looked back at his house, at the window where Sam's face was pressed against the glass, watching. He thought about the last 3 years, the struggle, the desperation, the constant weight of failure pressing down on him. And now, for the first time in longer than he could remember, someone was offering him a way forward, but nothing came without a cost. What's the catch? Caleb asked. Hawthorne smiled faintly. No catch, just hard work. Show up on time, do what's asked of you, and don't make me regret this. Caleb was silent for a long moment, the wind rustling through the dry grass around them. Finally, he nodded. All right, he said quietly. I'm in. Hawthorne extended his hand. Good. Be at the rail yard outside Dustridge tomorrow morning, 6 o'clock sharp. Ask for Dutch Patterson. He's my foreman. He'll get you started. Caleb shook his hand, the grip firm and steady. As Hawthorne turned and walked back toward the train, Caleb stood there, watching the steam engine slowly pull away, its whistle echoing across the open prairie. Inside the house, Sam ran out onto the porch, his eyes wide with excitement. Pa! What did he want? Caleb looked down at his son, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something other than dread. He gave me a job, Sam. The next morning, Caleb rose before dawn, the sky still dark and heavy with stars. He moved quietly through the small house, pulling on his cleanest shirt and his sturdiest boots. Sam was still asleep, curled up under a thin blanket, and Caleb paused in the doorway for a moment, watching the gentle rise and fall of his son's breathing. This was for him, all of it. He left a note on the table, gone to work. Back tonight, stay close to the house. Love, Pa, and slipped out into the cool morning air. Dusty was already awake, her ears flicking forward as he approached with her saddle. "Big day, girl," he murmured, cinching the straps. "Let's hope it's worth it." The ride to the rail yard took just under an hour, and by the time Caleb arrived, the sun was beginning to crest the horizon, painting the sky in shades of deep orange and gold. The yard was already alive with activity, men shouting orders, hammers ringing against steel, the hiss of steam engines idling on the tracks. Caleb dismounted and tied Dusty to a post near the entrance, then made his way through the organized chaos, looking for Dutch Patterson. He found him near a flatbed car loaded with timber, a stocky man with graying hair, a thick beard, and arms like tree trunks. He was barking orders at a crew of workers, his voice cutting through the noise like a whip crack. "You Patterson?" Caleb called, approaching cautiously. Dutch turned, his sharp eyes narrowing as he looked Caleb up and down. "Depends. Who's asking?" "Caleb Monroe. Hawthorne told me to report to you." Dutch's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his gaze. Curiosity, maybe, or skepticism. "So, you're the one. The one Hawthorne pulled out of nowhere and decided to give a shot." Dutch crossed his arms. "Word travels fast around here, Monroe. Everybody knows the boss doesn't just hand out jobs. So either you're real lucky or you did something to earn it." Caleb met his gaze evenly. "I just helped his daughter when she needed it." Dutch grunted. "That's so." He studied Caleb for another long moment, then jerked his head toward the work site. "Well, let's see if you can work as good as you can play hero. We're laying track west of here. Hard ground, long hours, no room for quitters. You up for that?" "I am." "Good. Grab a sledgehammer from the tool shed and get in line. We start in 5. The work was brutal, the kind that made every muscle scream and left blisters on top of blisters. Caleb swung the sledgehammer alongside a crew of rough, sun-hardened men, driving spikes into railroad ties under the unforgiving sun. Dust clung to his sweat-soaked skin, and his shoulders burned with every swing, but he didn't stop, didn't slow down, didn't complain. Dutch watched him throughout the day, his expression unreadable. At one point, when the crew took a short water break, he walked over and handed Caleb a canteen without a word. Caleb nodded his thanks and drank deeply before getting back to work. By the time the sun began to set, painting the prairie in deep purples and reds, the crew had laid nearly a quarter-mile of track. Caleb's hands were raw, his back aching, but there was a strange satisfaction in the exhaustion, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. He'd worked hard, and the results were visible, solid, real. As the men packed up their tools, Dutch approached again, wiping grime from his forehead with a dirty rag. "You did good today, Monroe," he said, his tone less gruff than before. "Better than I expected." Caleb straightened, rolling his shoulders. "Just did what it needed doing." Dutch nodded, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Hawthorne's got a good eye for people. I wasn't sure about you this morning, but you proved yourself." He paused, then added, "Be here same time tomorrow, and the day after that. Keep this up, and you'll have steady work for as long as you want it." Caleb felt something loosen in his chest. Relief, maybe, or hope. "I'll be here." The weeks that followed fell into a steady rhythm. Caleb arrived before dawn, worked until dusk, and rode home to Sam each night. The pay came every Friday, more than he'd seen in months, and slowly, steadily, the stack of bills on his kitchen table began to shrink. He paid Thornton at the bank, first 1 month, then 2, then 3. The banker's cold expression softened, just slightly, as Caleb handed over the cash. "Looks like you found some work, Monroe." "I did." Thornton counted the bills, then stamped the receipt. "Keep it up, and you might actually keep that ranch of yours." Caleb didn't respond. He just took the receipt and walked out, the weight on his shoulders a little lighter than before. At the rail yard, his reputation grew. The other workers, men who had initially eyed him with suspicion, began to nod when he arrived, to include him in their rough conversations during breaks. Dutch started giving him more responsibility, trusting him with crew coordination and quality checks. And then, one evening, as the crew was finishing up for the day, Dutch pulled him aside. "Hawthorne wants to see you," he said. Caleb frowned. "What for?" Dutch shrugged. "Didn't say, but when the boss calls, you go." Caleb rode into Dustridge the next morning, his stomach tight with uncertainty. Dutch had told him to meet Hawthorne at the railroad office, a sturdy brick building near the depot with Hawthorne and Western Railroad Company painted in bold letters across the front. He tied Dusty outside and stepped through the heavy wooden door. Inside, the air smelled of ink and paper, and a young clerk looked up from his desk. "Caleb Monroe," Caleb said. "Mr. Hawthorne's expecting me." The clerk nodded and gestured toward a hallway. "Last door on the left." Caleb walked down the narrow corridor, his boots echoing on the polished floor. He knocked once, and Hawthorne's voice called from inside. "Come in." Caleb stepped into the office. It was spacious, lined with maps and blueprints, a large mahogany desk dominating the center. Hawthorne sat behind it, reviewing a stack of papers, but he looked up as Caleb entered and gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit, Mr. Monroe." Caleb sat, keeping his posture straight, his hands resting on his knees. He had no idea what this was about, but after weeks of hard work, he wasn't about to let nerves show. Hawthorne set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, studying Caleb with that same sharp, assessing gaze he'd worn the first time they met. "Dutch tells me you've been doing excellent work," Hawthorne said. "Says you're reliable, disciplined, and the other men respect you." Caleb nodded, "Just trying to earn my keep." "You've done more than that." Hawthorne picked up a folder from his desk and slid it across to Caleb. "I'm expanding operations further west, building new lines, connecting territories that have never seen rail service before. It's ambitious work, and I need men I can trust to oversee it." Caleb opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. Contracts, maps, a position title, Site Foreman. His eyes widened slightly, and he looked up at Hawthorne. "You're offering me a promotion?" "I am," Hawthorne said. "You'd be managing crews, coordinating supply lines, ensuring the work stays on schedule. It's more responsibility, but it also comes with better pay, enough to not just keep your ranch, but to build it back up, maybe even expand it." Caleb stared at the papers, his mind racing. A month ago, he'd been 2 weeks from losing everything. Now he was being offered a future, a real one. "Why me?" Caleb asked, his voice quiet. Hawthorne leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Because when you found my daughter, you didn't see an opportunity. You saw a child who needed help, and you did what was right, even knowing it could cost you. That kind of character is rare, Monroe, and it's exactly what I need in the men who represent my company." Caleb swallowed hard, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He thought of Sam, of the dreams his boy had drawn on that scrap of paper, a house with a solid roof, a full corral, a future that didn't feel like a constant struggle. He looked up, meeting Hawthorne's gaze. "I accept." Hawthorne smiled and extended his hand across the desk. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Monroe." That evening, Caleb rode home as the sun dipped low on the horizon, bathing the prairie in warm golden light. When he reached the ranch, Sam was outside tossing stones at a rusty tin can balanced on a fence post. "Pa!" The boy ran toward him, grinning. "You're back." Caleb dismounted and crouched down, pulling Sam into a tight hug. "I'm back, bud." Sam pulled away, his eyes curious. "How was work?" Caleb stood, ruffling his son's hair. Good. Real good, actually. They walked toward the house together, and Sam chattered about his day, about the drawing he'd been working on, about a hawk he'd seen circling overhead. Caleb listened, his chest lighter than it had been in years. Inside, Sam ran to the small table where his drawings were spread out. He picked one up and handed it to Caleb.
I finished it, Pa. Look.
Caleb took the paper carefully. It was the same drawing Sam had been working on for weeks. A ranch with a sturdy house, a full corral of horses, a big barn, and a dog sitting on the porch. But this time, there were two figures standing in front of the house. One tall, one small. That's us, Sam said, pointing. You and me, when things get better. Caleb's throat tightened. He crouched down again, setting the drawing on the table and looking his son in the eye. They are getting better, Sam, he said quietly. And they're going to keep getting better. I promise. Sam's face lit up, and he threw his arms around Caleb's neck.
I knew it, Pa. I knew you'd figure it out.
Caleb held him close, his eyes stinging. For so long, he'd felt like he was drowning, like no matter how hard he fought, the world kept pulling him under. But now, for the first time, he could see the surface. He could see the light. That night, after Sam had gone to sleep, Caleb stepped outside and looked up at the stars. The air was cool, the prairie quiet, except for the distant howl of a coyote. He thought about the little girl by the tracks, about the choice he'd made, about how one moment, one decision to do the right thing, had changed everything. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he believed it could be good, and that was enough.